Hi, everybody. Here today, we're going to talk about the Great Depression in the United States. I think one of the biggest crises that the United States has faced in its history, I would say the only thing that's comparable is probably the Civil War of the 1860s over slavery and the nation of the nation itself. In the Great Depression, there was a real sense of like maybe this whole democratic express experiment has like run off the rails, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today. In our previous class, we talked a little bit about the early days of the New Deal, so I'm just going to try to jump right in and talk about some of the details, which are you know can feel a little bit too dense or something, but um, there's a lot there that's really important. So we need to talk about that. Um, let's see here. Um, so when Hoover was office, the economy completely went off the rails. There was all this unrestrained speculation, and everybody was trying to get in the stock market. Everybody thought the economy was going to just go up and up and up forever. Um, it seemed like American capitalism had solved all the problems of the world. And that's what Hoover ran on in 1928. Is like we're basically kind of right around the corner from ending poverty in America forever, which is just one of those deep, sad ironies. We've talked about Hoover in my class before. Um, I think he was, ultimately like a fundamentally decent man who just was not prepared to deal with the challenges that were put before him, because he was the truly self-made American man. Um, from his point of view, like there's nothing you couldn't accomplish by just hard work and dint of courage and industry. Uh, and then when this systemic catastrophe fell upon him, he just didn't seem to know exactly what to do. So we had this catastrophe of October 29th, 1929, this huge stock market crash, $10 billion one day on the stock market. It's hard to explain kind of like investing in the stock market to people a lot, because it doesn't really make that much sense. But like you buy shares in the company Apple, and then they start doing really well and they start making much money, and then your share becomes worth more. And then if you want to sell your share out and cash out, or maybe you think the share is going to keep going up, I mean, it is a little bit of gambling, but usually it's supposed to be based on some performance of the corporation that is involved. Um, what happened in the 1920s and what also happened in the 2000s is that people were investing in things that really weren't worth what they thought they were. Um, take the 2008 financial crash. Um, people were putting their investments in things that they were told were good, solid investments, but they were based on like bank loans that for mortgages that the people they'd given loans to were just almost never going to be able to pay back. But then those people and their like financial advisors and brokers and whoever is handling their accounts were told, oh, it's totally solid, it's good. And then the bottom fell out. That's pretty much what happened in 1929, more or less. You have people who lose almost all of their family savings or retirement. Um, 25% unemployment. It's hard to exactly define what employment is in that time, but it's pretty bad. And so people are extremely destitute. It's a very dark situation. We talked about the Bonus Army, one of the darkest chapters in American history, in my opinion. A bunch of veterans and their families who are unemployed and impoverished. Veterans of World War I, primarily, who um, were just like, can the government do anything for me? Like, I fought for this country. I probably got my brain fucked up by like PTSD. Um, can you just like literally give us, they were going to give them their money in like 1941, like this delayed bonus. The bonus army people were like, can you just like kind of give it to me now? And then the federal government like rained hell on them when they tried to set up shanty towns outside of Washington, D.C. The fact, though, is that this was actually a global phenomenon. We in the United States are very like tempted most of the time to think that what happens to us is uniquely about us. Just like we're the most important people in the world and blah blah blah. But like oftentimes the trends that happen here translate across the board into other places. And so in the 1920s, 1930s, there were a lot of different countries that were trying to cope with this crisis of capitalism in their own way. Chief among them, Germany. Coming out of World War I, they were given a pretty crappy deal out of it that blamed them for everything that happened in World War I. They were supposed to pay reparations. And the German economy was plagued by hyperinflation and unemployment all through the 20s when they were trying to have a democratic system, a new democratic republic, after having the like empire, the German empire of the Kaiser before the war. So you have, places like Italy and Germany where things are not good during the 20s. And that gives rise to fascism in the form of Benito Mussolini in Italy and fascism or Nazism in the form of Adolf Hitler in Germany in the late 20s and early 30s. People are really scared. People are really messed up. They're like, I have to push a wheelbarrow of Deutschmarks to the store just to buy a pound of flour because of hyperinflation. Like, that makes you think that things are not going too good. And when you start to feel very frustrated and scared and just beyond your limit, then you're willing to maybe think, well, whoever's able to show up and straighten things out, like, I'm going to be for that. If it's Mussolini, Hitler, if they can just make things better again, then I'm going to go for that because I'm just a little normal person. Like, I can't even buy like eggs to feed my family. So if this Hitler guy comes along, or Mussolini, it's like, well, they seem to have an idea of what they're talking about. So this is the big difference between the United States and most of the other countries in Western Europe, is that the United States pursues this sort of center-left path. It's weird how we get there, but like in the UK and France, there are like conservative parties in power, that not like right wing, like fascist, but like conservative parties. And then in like Italy and Germany, there's like fascist parties. In places like Russia, there's or the Soviet Union, there's communism. So the United States kind of charts this centrist path that's more to a little bit to the left. And the whole idea is to preserve capitalism, though. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he had run for vice president in 1920, totally destroyed. But he had been the governor of New York during the early parts of the Great Depression, and then he ran for president and won in a gigantic landslide. But what FDR's main brief is to preserve capitalism, to try to keep this whole system from falling apart. Ironically, FDR actually campaigned as a fiscal conservative, which is hilarious because once FDR was president, he embarked on one of the biggest like deficit spending sprees in American history. But when FDR was running for president, he said Herbert Hoover spent too much government money. He was so fiscally irresponsible. But when FDR, like all politicians, like if you ever study politicians, they tend to change what they are saying and believe like a lot. Um, FDR got in there and then he was like, okay, we're going to spend a shit ton of government money to try to fix the situation. So to talk about FDR is very complicated. He was an aristocrat. I mean, he really the closest thing to an American aristocrat. Um, he came from one of the old money families in the Hudson River Valley in New York. Um, Old money. He went to Harvard. He went to Columbia. Um, he had the golden boy life. Everything went perfectly for him. He was on a glide path to being vice president or president or senator. Like everything in his upbringing had led to that. And he ran for vice president in 1920, as I just mentioned. But then, sometime in the early 20s, he got polio, and his legs were to a significant extent disabled. For a rich boy who had like a golden path his entire life, this was a big change. Like, you had been the golden boy your entire life, and now you need people to help you do things. You're dependent on other people. I don't want to psychoanalyze too much, but like, I do think that this made a difference in FDR's point of view because he realized what it's like to be vulnerable, and maybe like influenced the way he thought about people who are poor or in need or um, people who are struggling, because he had never struggled for anything his entire life. I do think that's somewhat true. Um, because of his polio, FDR mostly lost the use of his legs. I'm sorry, I have this like speech thing, but they were able to hide it a lot, like by having him like use braces when he was walking or doing speeches. But he was disabled. When he came into power, FDR is not like a philosopher king. I mean, he's not like the smartest guy in the room. He doesn't really he's not a political philosopher. He's a politician, and he's just willing to do whatever people like want him to do. So when FDR comes in, he says the country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. Which is a very eloquent way of saying I have no idea what I'm doing. When FDR comes in office, this is in 1933, in the spring of 1933, the Depression is at its very depths. Like, people are very hopeless. People have been unemployed for several years. And FDR doesn't really have a plan what to do with this, but they call it the New Deal. So this is like the social contract that like Rousseau or John Locke talk about. The contract between the people and their government. What FDR is saying is there's a new deal. Remember when we talked about like Lochner v. New York and Mueller v. Oregon, all that stuff? Like, the whole idea was like the government doesn't have any role to be involved in this. If you want to work for 5 cents an hour, and you agree to it in a contract with another person, no problem. It's not the government's deal at all. If you want to be in Scientology and agree to scrub floors with a toothpick for the next 5 billion years in a contract, that's your deal. You can choose to do that. But the idea that the government would set like minimum wages or overtime laws or workman comps laws was kind of completely written out of the situation in the late 19th and early 20th century. But during the New Deal in the 1930s, this started to change. There was this idea that like the government could actually like say, oh, the minimum wage is $2 an hour or whatever it might have been back then. that the government has some sort of role to play in establishing the parameters of what like economic life would be. So when FDR comes in, they want to try just everything they can, just throw everything at the problem. This is the first 100 days, the first 100 days of her presidency. FDR comes in office saying, all we have to fear is fear itself. But they wanted to like stabilize the economy because it was going through the fucking floor. This was a really dark period of time for the American economy. So one of the first things that FDR and his administration did was to close the banks, close all the banks, because everybody was taking their money out of the banks, and it was leading to a financial collapse. I don't want to go too much into how banking works, but like, basically, when you deposit your check from your job into your checking account or savings account, like the bank takes that $1 and lends it out to like 4 or 5 people. And that's somebody who's starting a new smoothie business. That's somebody who's starting a new axe throwing business. It's somebody who's trying to buy a home. The banks, you give the banks your money, and then they lend each dollar that you have out multiple times to different people. And that grows the economy because once that smoothie business owner starts making a profit, then they pay back the money to the bank with interest. And then the bank makes a profit. And then the money supply grows because like there's more people making and earning money. That's how it's supposed to work. But if the whole economy falls apart and every single person is going there asking for the money at the same time, then it doesn't work at all because the bank is like, well, I lent your money out like 5 or 6 times. Like, I don't actually have it. Like, you come and ask me for it all at once. I don't have it. And so that was the logic behind this idea of a bank holiday, to say we're closing the banks. No one can show up like asking for the deposits out. Let's just try to stem the bleeding, like stanch the bleeding. Like, let's just try to like get this thing under control. And that's the reason why the government came up with the idea of Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, which was a program that would insure the deposits of most commercial retail, like, account holders in the US. So say you have $3,000 in your checking account or savings account, and say Big Bubba's bank goes out of business, you have all your things invested in it, even though you probably shouldn't have had them invested in a bank called Big Bubba's Bank, but that's fine. If that Big Bubba's Bank goes out of business and you've got your $3,000 in your checking or savings account and it's FDI insured, the federal government will just give you that money. Now, what's the point of that? The point is to try to ensure confidence in the banking system so that when you get your check, you'll be willing to deposit in the bank, and then they can lend it out to other individuals and businesses to, create wealth and grow the economy. If no one's willing to do that, then there will be no financial system, there'll be no banks. So they're trying to make you comfortable when you get your check from the restaurant that you work at, or the coffee shop, or the office, or the factory, that you're willing to like deposit into your checking or savings account and just assume that it'll still be there and that you don't have to fear about it. That's what this whole concept was about. And we still have the FDIC to this day. Then the FDR administration tries to get into this thing called the National Recovery Administration, or NRA. Their symbol is the blue eagle, which you can see in the slides that I'm going to post on iCollege. This was a very misguided plan, in my opinion, but it shows where the FDR Democrats were at the time in 1933 or 1934. They really thought that they could preempt socialism or communism by coming up with a voluntary system of regulation for business. So what the National Recovery Administration, or NRA, proposed is that, like, in the steel industry or the textile industry or whatever, like the 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 corporations and the labor groups and the government can all like sit down and come up with a decision about, like, we're going to set the price of you know rubbed cotton for 5 cents a load. I'm just making things up. I don't know, but like that in each industry we could try to stabilize the economy by setting certain prices and certain wages. And if businesses just voluntarily agreed to do that, then we could stop the depression. It was trying to stabilize the situation because it was in what economists call a deflationary spiral, which is like everybody stops spending as much, and so like costs, like prices, go down, and they keep going down. Like, well, if I know that something's going to cost less 15% next week, then I'll just wait to buy it next week. That's called a deflationary spiral. And that's kind of what the American economy was in the early 30s. So what the NRA was trying to do, the National Recovery Administration, was trying to like create like a floor underneath this just complete spiral of despair. It relied on businesses actually voluntarily cooperating with this, which was very naive. Um, the Roosevelt government thought that, like, oh well, we can just, they asked people to put like posters in their front window with a blue eagle saying, we're doing our part. But like, if you're a business, you're gonna just try to sell things at the cheapest price and make the most profit. Like, that's just how things are gonna work. And that's just what happened. Like, it just ended up not working out. But the FDR administration thought that this National Recovery Administration thing could work to try to stabilize prices and wages, and actually did give some like say for organized labor, like unions, to like have a seat at the table. But it was something that was just not going to work. Um, so the NRA, this whole policy gets struck down by the Supreme Court. Does not work. Other things that the FDR government does in the 30s that are actually more significant. The NRA was just such almost a complete like failure because it just seemed to completely like not understand how like capitalism works. Um, there were other agencies part of the New Deal that actually did like build roads and bridges and parks and things like that. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a big deal in like Western Tennessee and Eastern North Carolina and Northern Georgia. I mean, some of you guys might have direct experience with this. It was basically a big power company that was set up by the US government to provide electrification to these extremely poor parts of like Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, that were so remote, but like using water power and stuff to like provide the electrification that would allow for people to, I don't know, like buy radios, buy fridges. Like, if you're in the middle of podunk nowhere and like no company wants to run a cable to your place because you're so poor, the government steps in and actually like creates infrastructure. So that's kind of what happened there. There was also this thing called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA. It's hard to explain, but basically what they were trying to do is to take all these farmers, particularly in the South and the Midwest, and prop up their incomes. They'd been, I mean, we've talked about this before, they'd been suffering since at least the 1880s, 1890s. Like, farmers in the South and Midwest had been like falling behind and being crushed by debt for like decades. What the AAA, or Agricultural Adjustment Act, tried to do is to say, okay, we, the federal government, will pay you to grow less crops. So say you're growing corn or wheat or cotton, we'll pay you to grow 30% less of that. And we'll actually give you a money payment, a monetary payment. Like we'll send in the mail that you can cash and cash your check if you grow 30% less stuff. Now, why would you want to do that? Like, why would you want people to grow less food or less cotton? Because the prices for farmers were so catastrophically low and had been for a long time. If we could stabilize the market and by essentially telling the farmers to grow less stuff and we pay them to grow less stuff, then maybe the price of cotton or corn or wheat will stabilize at a certain level that these farmers can stay in business. It seems pretty crazy to pay farmers not to grow things. I mean, I know that sounds so counterintuitive, but it really did save a lot of small farmers throughout the South, Midwest, the West, um, who had just like been struggling and barely getting by, creating all the things that we eat and use. One of the unintentional side effects of the Agricultural Adjustment Act is that it kind of unintentionally, this is true of so many New Deal policies in general, um, kind of pushed the most vulnerable people off the land. Um, so if you were a black tenant farmer or a white sharecropper who was working on the land of somebody who owned land, and then the government comes along and says, we'll pay you more money to not farm 30% of your land or 20% of your land. Then you look at these dudes over here, you're like, I'm sorry, Dave, like you gotta go. Like I'm renting this property off to you, but if the government's gonna pay me more money to like not grow this area of land, then you gotta go. And this happens to black and white farmers alike. It fell more heavily on African American farmers who are more likely to be tenant or sharecropper farmers. But like, it was not the intention of the policy to push marginal farmers off of the market. But that's what happened because the guys who actually owned the land were the ones who were getting the benefits from the government that were saying, oh, we'll pay you $1,000 if you don't cultivate this 10% of your land, because we want to try to create price supports for agricultural commodities. I hope this makes sense. A lot of it seems so crazy, but like if you think about what things were like in the 20s or 30s, I think it does make sense. Like there was this complete collapse in the agricultural economy. And for the federal government to come in and try to aid the farmers ended up helping the farmers who owned land and who were more successful. And the people who were tenant or sharecropper farmers um, ended up getting shorted in the stick, because it's like, you're going to pay me to like have less of my land under cultivation. Okay, you gotta go. And this is part of the reason why the great migration of black Americans to the North and the West happened. I mean, it's part of the reason. And also, these mostly white landowners and farm owners were able to use the money they got from the government to reinvest in like tractors and mechanization and stuff. So, I mean, it transformed agriculture in the South and the Midwest. That's not exactly what the policymakers were intending. I'm pretty sure that's not what they had in mind, but that is what ended up happening. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act is one of the big things in the New Deal. Um, there's also the Federal Housing Administration, um, which was trying to promote the idea of home ownership among Americans, like to try to help working class and lower middle class and middle class families to have the ability to buy a home. This the FHA, like I mean, if any of you have a home loan or if your parents have a home loan, it's probably an FHA loan, which means that it's being subsidized by the federal government in terms of the insurance and all that. Um, the ideal here was to try to make as many Americans as possible homeowners. This had some unfortunate side effects, which included redlining and segregation. That's not what the original FHA policy was intended to do, but it did. The way it was implemented on the local level ended up like very much disadvantaging Black, Latino, Asian American, Jewish communities because of the way the loans were handed out and the way that things were assessed. This is basically called redlining. That's not the intention of the FHA law as it was originally passed, but that's the way it was implemented on the local level. So these are some of the big parts of the New Deal. The the NRA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the FHA. Those were big parts of the first part of the New Deal. And a lot of those things got struck down by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional. But you do see this big change in 1935, where basically the Supreme Court is striking down almost everything FDR wants to do. And unions on the local level are getting more and more militant. Like the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, they're way more militant than the old like AFL or American Federation of Labor. They represent like auto workers, mine workers, people who used to be considered unskilled workers. And so the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, starts taking much more aggressive radical tactics to protest their employers and strikes and things like that. So there's this pivot in 1935 where FDR's earlier like efforts are clearly not working, not doing enough. And when FDR has to run for re-election, then he starts like trying some things that are a little bit more like radical, a little bit more out there. This is what historians, who are really great at naming things, call the second New Deal. So the first New Deal was all this like farm stuff and NRA and all that. The second New Deal is Social Security, providing old age pensions for people, providing support for poor single mothers through welfare. The Wagner Act, which we're going to talk about, which basically enshrines the rights of unions to organize and have collective bargaining. The Works Progress Administration, which does all kinds of stuff like building bridges and post offices and making murals, and hiring writers and painters and actors. We're going to talk about that next time, but I just want to leave us here because, I mean, the arc from 1928, when it seemed like, American capitalism was at its highest point of triumph. Herbert Hoover could rightly say that, like, we're as close as we've ever been to eliminating poverty. Like, people really believed that. And then the bottom fell out. And then, like, someone like Hoover really didn't know exactly what to do about it. And somebody like FDR also did not know what to do about it. But he brought in an administration of people who were just throwing everything at the wall to try to figure out what to do about it. And so we got this thing called the New Deal. We're going to talk about this more in our class as we continue to talk about the New Deal and its repercussions, and also how that relates to World War II. But I just want to leave it there because I know I've been talking too much. But I hope that, I can go into a little bit more depth about like some of the mistakes that FDR made and some of the complications and some of the policies for sure. But I just want to leave it there because we can come back to it next time. But between now and then, I just wanted to say thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please, of course, always, send me an email or we'll talk during or after class on WebEx. You know my email, so I'll see you then. All right. Thanks for listening, guys. Have a good night. Bye.